Long before stealth bombers or computer models, there was a man who wanted to give flight a new shape. His name was Jack Northrop. He wasn't loud or famous like other aviation pioneers. He didn't crave medals or headlines. He was an engineer who believed that perfection in flight meant simplicity, that one day an aircraft could exist without waste, without drag, without a single unnecessary line. Just a wing. Nothing more. In the 1920s, while most airplanes were still made of wood and fabric, Northrop was already drawing sketches that looked like they came from another century, sleek, tailless silhouettes gliding across the page. His co-workers at Lockheed called him the dreamer. But he wasn't dreaming. He was calculating. Northrop understood something that others ignored. In every airplane, the fuselage, the tail, and the struts were all parasites of flight. They added weight and drag without adding lift. Only the wing truly flew, so why not make the entire aircraft a wing? That single idea became his life's obsession. In 1939, as the world inched toward war, he formed his own company in California, Northrop Aircraft Incorporated. The country was still crawling out of the Great Depression. Factories were quiet, fuel was expensive, and most people thought his flying wing would never even leave the ground. Yet in a dusty hangar outside Los Angeles, Jack Northrop and a small team began shaping wood, aluminum, and ambition into something that had never existed before. They called it the N1MM, for mock-up a small, stubby, tailless test aircraft. It was built almost entirely of wood, covered in bright yellow plywood panels sealed with glue and varnish. There was no metal skin, no tail fin, not even a cockpit canopy, just a small plexiglass bubble for the pilot. To the mechanics around it, it looked like a toy. To Northrop, it was the first glimpse of the future. While Europe burned and the skies above Poland and France filled with fighters, his tiny wooden prototype rolled onto a dry lake bed in the Mojave Desert. It was July 1940. The test pilot, Vance Breen, climbed inside and throttled up. The N1M trembled, skipped across the sand, and suddenly lifted off. For a brief moment, it hung in the air, awkward, twitchy, unstable, but flying. Witnesses said Jack Northrop didn't cheer. He simply exhaled, smiled faintly, and said, "Now we begin." Over the following months, the team refined the design. They adjusted the wing sweep, balanced the control surfaces, and experimented with trim tabs until the aircraft could be flown safely barely. It was slow, never climbing higher than a few hundred feet, but every flight taught them something new about aerodynamics. The N1M revealed how a tailless plane could balance itself, how airflow curved around the edges, how even the smallest change in surface angle could stabilize an entire machine. These discoveries would later define the mathematics of stealth flight. Word of the strange little aircraft spread quietly through the Army Air Corps. At first, officials were skeptical. The prototype looked fragile, a plywood bird in a world turning to metal. But the data was undeniable. The wing produced more lift for less drag than anything in the S arsenal. In late 1941, just before America entered the war, the military invited Jack Northrop to Washington to discuss scaling up his design into a long-range bomber, one that could cross oceans and strike Europe without refueling. Northrop accepted without hesitation. When he returned to California, he found his small company suddenly flooded with military interest. Engineers arrived with slide rules and notebooks, eager to see the odd yellow wing that had everyone talking. The Army wanted a prototype large enough to carry bombs, fuel, and accrue something with the range of a B-17, but half the drag. It sounded impossible. Northrop didn't think so. One engineer recalled that when the sunlight hit the polished plywood, the aircraft looked alive like something that wanted to fly. Northrop's design philosophy was spreading beyond his company. Across the Atlantic, German engineers were studying similar concepts. The Horton brothers were experimenting with their own flying wing gliders, dreaming of fast, radar-defying jet aircraft. Neither side knew about the other. Both were racing toward the same revelation that the purest shape in the sky was also the hardest to see. But for now, Jack Northrop's project remained secret. The Army assigned it the experimental code MX-140, and the engineers worked under armed guard. They didn't yet know that their wooden prototype possessed another hidden advantage, something that radar operators would soon notice. Wood didn't reflect radar waves the way metal did. Early Allied tests with radar sets found that when the N1M flew past, its echo on the screen almost disappeared. At first, technicians thought their equipment had failed, but when they checked again, the signal was still faint. The little wooden aircraft was, in its own way, invisible. It wasn't intentional. It was discovery by accident, stealth before stealth had a name. In December 1941, the attack on Pearl Harbor changed everything. The United States was at war, and suddenly every visionary design mattered. Jack Northrop's modest shop was thrust into the heart of the military's new industrial machine. The brass wanted speed, altitude, range, anything that could give America the edge. Northrop promised all three. He submitted formal plans for a full-scale flying wing, a massive long-range bomber powered by 4 engines hidden inside the wing itself. The military approved it under the name XB-35. Work began immediately, even as the United States mobilized for global conflict. For Jack Northrop, it was the moment he had waited for his entire life. The flying wing was no longer a dream or a hobby project, it was a weapon of war. Yet behind the triumph was a quiet sense of awe. His little wooden wing had proven that the impossible could fly. Now, in a world that had lost its balance, he would try to build perfection out of chaos. And though he didn't know it, the shape he was about to create, smooth, curved, and nearly invisible to radar, would outlive him by half a century. The war transformed everything. In a matter of months, quiet hangars became assembly lines. Engineers became officers, and Jack Northrop's dream, once dismissed as an eccentric hobby, became part of the US war effort. By early 1942, the Army Air Forces had formally commissioned Northrop to build 2 prototypes of his radical new bomber, the XB-35 Flying Wing. It was to be a long-range strategic weapon capable of crossing oceans, carrying 10 tons of bombs, and returning home without refueling. For an engineer obsessed with efficiency, it was a perfect challenge. For the military, it was a gamble. No aircraft like it had ever existed. No fuselage, no tail, just a massive, continuous wing 172 feet from tip to tip, with the cockpit, fuel tanks, engines, and bombs all hidden inside. On paper, it promised unmatched range and performance. But on the shop floor, it was a nightmare of mathematics and geometry. Every part of the aircraft had to serve more than one purpose. The structure that carried fuel also carried load. The surface that provided lift also had to house people. Every mistake risked disaster. Northrop's engineers worked around the clock. They slept under drafting tables and lived on coffee and cigarettes. Because aluminum was scarce, the first test models were built mostly of wood, reinforced with glue and steel joints. That decision would change the aircraft's destiny. Radar was still new science. In 1942, it was mostly used for detecting ships and bombers. But in experimental tests in Southern California, radar operators began noticing something strange. When a conventional bomber like a B-17 passed overhead, the radar scope lit up bright and strong. But when one of Northrop's wooden flying wing mock-ups flew through the same range, the signal almost vanished. The radar operator thought the equipment was malfunctioning. He recalibrated, adjusted frequency, tried again. Still nothing. The little wooden model, with its smooth curves and lack of metal surfaces, barely reflected any signal at all. It was there, but the radar couldn't see it. Word spread quietly through the program. The aircraft's unique shape and its material made it nearly invisible to radar. It was an accident of physics, decades ahead of its time. Northrop never used the word stealth. That concept didn't exist yet, but he understood what he had stumbled upon. The smoothness of the wing, its gentle curves and hidden engines, created no sharp corners for radio waves to bounce off. The wooden skin absorbed and scattered the signal. Without knowing it, he had built the first radar-deflecting aircraft in history. He didn't brag about it. He simply took notes. By mid-1943, the war's focus was long-range bombing. The Allies needed aircraft that could strike the heart of enemy industry, Berlin, Tokyo, and beyond. Northrop's Flying Wing promised range far beyond the B-17 or B-24. With its efficient lift and low drag, it could theoretically cross the Atlantic, bomb targets in Europe, and return without landing in Britain. It could carry fuel like a tanker and bombs like a fortress. But not everyone shared Jack's enthusiasm. At Wright Field, the Army's test command was skeptical. The design was too unconventional, too fragile, too unproven. One general famously remarked, "It looks like something out of Buck Rogers." Yet the results were impossible to ignore. In simulations and wind tunnel tests, the Flying Wing's performance shattered expectations. It consumed less fuel, produced less drag, and could lift more weight than any aircraft of its size. The Army doubled its funding. The factory in Hawthorne, California expanded. The small wooden test models were replaced by full-scale mock-ups, their smooth yellow plywood skin gleaming under floodlights. To the workers building it, the XB-35 looked alive like a giant bird emerging from a cocoon. While Jack Northrop's team refined their wooden masterpiece, halfway across the world another pair of visionaries, Riemar and Walter Horton, were working on something eerily similar for Germany. Their jet-powered Ho-229 Flying Wing shared the same sleek, tailless profile. It too was made of wood mixed with charcoal dust to absorb radar. Two nations, locked in total war, were unknowingly building the same impossible dream, a bomber that could glide through the air unseen. Both projects were shaped by desperation. In Germany, the Horton brothers hoped their Flying Wing would save the Reich from ruin. In America, Jack Northrop believed his would secure a future beyond it. The difference was time. Northrop's design had the luxury of safety and resources. The Hortons built theirs under air raids and shortages. But both men were guided by the same vision, the idea that a perfect wing could defy both gravity and detection. As the war dragged on, the XB-35's construction became a test of endurance. Every month, the Army sent new demands: more range, heavier payloads, stronger engines. Each demand meant redesigning the aircraft's internal systems from scratch. Engines had to be buried deep within the wing to preserve aerodynamics, but this created cooling problems. Propeller shafts twisted and cracked. Gearboxes overheated. The engines themselves, 4 Pratt & Whitney Wasp majors, were enormous and complex, each one producing 3,000 horsepower. They strained the very structure of the aircraft. Northrop's engineers adapted as fast as they could. But the work was slow, and the war moved faster. While the B-29 Superfortress entered combat over Japan, Northrop's wooden wings were still being tested on the California coast. Each time one rolled onto the runway, crowds gathered to watch the strange tailless shape rise into the air. It didn't look like a bomber. It looked like something from the future. Throughout 1944, the Army quietly conducted radar trials with the XB-35 prototypes. The results confirmed what the early operators had noticed. Radar systems struggled to detect it. Its radar cross-section, though the term didn't yet exist, was a fraction of conventional bombers. To many officers, it didn't matter. The war was nearly over, and what they wanted now was speed. Jet engines were arriving, and propeller bombers were already being labeled obsolete. But to a handful of scientists and strategists, the wooden Flying Wing was a glimpse into something far more valuable: the art of invisibility. In an era when radar was the new guardian of the skies, a plane that couldn't be seen was worth more than gold. Yet few understood what they had in front of them. The XB-35 wasn't just efficient, it was revolutionary. But revolutions don't always arrive when people are ready for them. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was ending. The factories slowed. The Army cancelled contracts. Projects deemed non-essential were scrapped. Jack Northrop's program was almost one of them. But the engineers refused to stop. Even with half their funding gone, they worked on, determined to see the Flying Wing completed. When Germany finally surrendered, Northrop received permission to finish 2 full prototypes. The aircraft that had begun as a wooden model now stood as a massive, gleaming machine, 50 tons of aluminum, steel, and ambition. The war that had made it possible was over, but a new one was already beginning. The race for technology had only just started, and Jack Northrop's Flying Wing, born in wood, invisible to radar, and too advanced for its time, was about to face its greatest test: the politics of peace. The war had ended, but Jack Northrop's war was just beginning. While the world celebrated victory, he stood in his hangar, surrounded by the half-finished skeleton of the machine he'd fought for years to build, the XB-35 Flying Wing. To most people, the war's end meant peace. To Northrop, it meant deadlines, inspections, and budgets that vanished overnight. The Army Air Forces, now preparing for peacetime, had little patience for experimental designs. Yet Northrop's team pressed on. They believed their creation wasn't just another bomber, it was the future of aviation itself. By late 1945, the first full-scale XB-35 was finally complete. It was enormous, 172 feet from wingtip to wingtip, longer than a Boeing 707, yet without a fuselage or tail. Its cockpit was built directly into the leading edge of the wing. Behind it lay a honeycomb of fuel tanks, cables, and bomb bays. The structure was a work of art, polished aluminum wrapped around wooden frames that had evolved from the wartime prototypes. It was light, aerodynamic, and eerily smooth. When the aircraft rolled out of the Hawthorne plant for the first time, even hardened test pilots stopped to stare. It didn't look like it belonged to their century. It looked like something unearthed from a future they couldn't yet imagine. To those who had labored on it, the Flying Wing wasn't just an airplane. It was proof that human imagination could reshape the sky. On June 25, 1946, the XB-35 lifted off from Muroc Airfield, what would later become Edwards Air Force Base. Observers on the ground gasped as it rose into the desert light, its four massive pusher propellers turning behind the wing. It seemed to glide rather than climb. The noise was low, almost ghostly. For a moment it looked like flight itself had been reinvented. Test pilot Max Stanley described the sensation as floating inside a single heartbeat of air. But perfection in design rarely means perfection in performance. The engines vibrated violently, shaking the aircraft like a drum. The propeller shafts twisted under the stress, and oil leaks forced the crew to turn back after less than an hour. When it landed, one mechanic said it looked as if it had flown through time and barely survived the trip. Still, it had flown, and that was enough to keep the dream alive. Over the next months, engineers fought to refine the design. The Flying Wing's aerodynamics were flawless, but its mechanics were unforgiving. The complex gearboxes that transferred power from the engines to the propellers constantly failed. The engines themselves overheated, and the aircraft's stability at low speeds demanded constant attention. Jack Northrop refused to give up. He'd faced skepticism before. This was no different. "Every new idea is born ugly," he told a journalist. "It takes time to grow into its purpose." The Army Air Forces continued testing, fascinated by what the radar operators were seeing, or rather, what they weren't seeing. When the XB-35 passed through radar range, it almost disappeared. The same stealth-like qualities first discovered during the war were confirmed again, this time on a massive scale. To Northrop, it was vindication. To the Air Force, it was a curiosity interesting, but impractical. They wanted altitude and speed, and they wanted it now. The world had entered the jet age, and the Flying Wing was still powered by propellers. By 1947, Northrop proposed a bold solution. He would replace the piston engines with jet turbines. The new version, designated the IB-49, would be faster, sleeker, and nearly silent in flight. The concept was daring and risky. The new jet engines would require redesigning nearly every system on the aircraft, but Northrop saw it as destiny. The clean lines of his wing had always belonged to a jet-powered future. This was the moment to make it real. The Air Force approved 2 prototypes for conversion. The first IB-49 rolled out of the hangar in 1947, a vision in silver, with no propellers, no tail, and no noise but the whisper of its jet exhaust. It looked almost identical to the aircraft that would one day be called the B-2 Spirit. When test pilots took it up, it stunned everyone. It climbed faster than any bomber before it. It turned with the grace of a fighter, and on radar screens it was barely visible. The aircraft of the future had arrived, but it had come at the wrong time. The world was changing too quickly for Jack Northrop. The same military that once called him a genius now called him outdated. The B-29 had ended the war, and new bombers like the B-47 Stratojet promised higher speeds and nuclear payloads. These were traditional aircraft with fuselages, tails, and long, narrow wings. They were easier to build, easier to maintain, and already had contracts waiting. Northrop's design was too different, too unconventional. Even its success was a threat to the companies that had dominated wartime production: Boeing, Convair, Douglas. In Washington, politics had replaced innovation. Yet in the desert skies of California, the Flying Wing proved what was possible. In one test, it flew from Los Angeles to Washington, D.C. in record time, crossing the entire country in under 5 hours. When it landed, radar stations along the route reported the same strange result. They couldn't track it. The shape of the future was already here and almost invisible, but success in the air didn't guarantee survival on the ground. Behind the scenes, rival firms lobbied against the project. Generals questioned its stability. Funding was quietly cut. The Air Force ordered fewer test flights. Jack Northrop watched helplessly as politics began to smother his creation. For a brief, shining moment, the Flying Wing represented everything humanity could achieve when imagination and engineering worked together. It was the perfect airplane, a machine that wasted nothing, lifted everything, and slipped through the sky like thought itself. But technology doesn't live in isolation. It depends on timing, power, and people willing to defend it. and as 1947 drew to a close, Jack Northrop realized he was running out of all three. The war that had given birth to his dream had also cursed it. The military that once needed innovation now feared it. The Flying Wing had survived every challenge of physics, but it was about to meet the one force it could never outfly: bureaucracy. By 1948, the Flying Wing had proven it could fly faster, farther and quieter than any bomber of its time. But inside the walls of Washington, performance wasn't everything. Politics had taken the controls. Jack Northrop's aircraft had become a threat not to the enemy, but to the establishment. For decades, the military's aircraft programs had been dominated by a few powerful companies: Boeing, Convair, Douglas. They built conventional planes with conventional shapes using familiar systems. The Flying Wing was different. Too different. It had no tail, no fuselage, and no room for compromise. If it worked, it would make half of America's aviation industry obsolete overnight. That kind of revolution never comes without enemies. In 1948, the newly formed US Air Force, no longer part of the Army, began re-evaluating its bomber programs. The Cold War was taking shape. Nuclear weapons demanded aircraft that could carry heavier payloads, fly higher, and operate on jet power alone. On paper, the IB-49 fit those requirements perfectly. It was already jet-powered, stable at high altitudes, and nearly invisible to radar. But behind the scenes, senior officers questioned its practicality. Maintenance was difficult. The engines were buried deep within the wing. The bomber lacked a proper bomb bay for the new, larger nuclear devices. Officially, these were the reasons given for hesitation. Unofficially, other pressures were at work. Convair had just begun production of the B-36 Peacemaker, a massive, traditional bomber that stretched longer than a football field. It was expensive, slow, and outdated even before its first flight. But Convair had powerful friends in Congress and in the Air Force procurement offices. The B-36 represented jobs, votes, and political stability. The IB-49 represented disruption. Still, Northrop's team refused to surrender. They continued flight tests through 1948 and 1949, gathering data that amazed even the skeptics. The IB-49 could cruise at 40,000 feet, fly faster than any bomber in service, and consume less fuel. Radar operators reported the same baffling result as before. The aircraft was almost invisible on their screens. The press began calling it the ghost plane. But ghosts make people nervous, and in Washington the whispers began: unstable, unsafe, unnecessary. One of the most tragic chapters came on June 5, 1948. During a routine test flight, the second IB-49 prototype broke apart in the air over the Mojave Desert. The aircraft disintegrated mid-flight, killing all 5 crew members, including Major Daniel Forbes and Captain Glenn Edwards, both respected Air Force pilots. In their memory, 2 major Air Force bases were renamed: Forbes Field in Kansas and Edwards Air Force Base in California. The crash was a devastating blow. The official report blamed structural failure, violent oscillations caused by the jet engines that the original design had never been built to handle. But to Jack Northrop, the loss went deeper. These were men who had believed in him, men who had risked their lives for his vision. The program never truly recovered. After the crash, internal Air Force politics turned ruthless. Convair's lobbyists pushed harder. Congressional committees were fed reports labeling the Flying Wing as unreliable and experimental. The B-36 was painted as safer, simpler, and already in production. Behind closed doors, contracts were quietly shifted away from Northrop. Funding for the IB-49 tests was reduced. Then, in early 1950, the final order came down. The Flying Wing project is terminated. Jack Northrop read the memo in silence. Years of work gone with a single signature. He appealed to the Air Force, arguing that a design as efficient and advanced as the IB-49 would one day be essential. He was right, but the answer came back cold and final. The military had chosen to back the B-36, a slower, older, louder machine. It wasn't science that decided, it was politics. In February 1950, under direct orders, the prototypes were dismantled. Not stored, not preserved, destroyed. Workers at Northrop's own plant were forced to carry out the demolition. Bulldozers cut through the smooth aluminum skin. Hydraulic claws tore the wings apart. Mechanics who had spent years building the aircraft stood in silence, some turning away as the metal groaned and collapsed. One engineer later said, It felt like watching someone burn a library. When the pieces were finally hauled away, the hangar floor was empty. No trace of the flying wing remained, except in the memories of those who had seen it fly. Jack Northrop, defeated and disillusioned, left his company soon after. He withdrew from public life, suffering from heart problems that would follow him for the rest of his years. The man who had dreamed of perfect flight now walked with a cane. He never spoke publicly about the cancellation again. Decades later, declassified documents revealed that internal politics had indeed sealed the Flying Wing's fate. Convair's executives had warned Air Force officials that if the IB-49 entered production, their own factories would close within a year. The cost of retooling was too great, the technology was too new, so they buried it. The Flying Wing didn't fail because it couldn't fly. It failed because it flew too well. It was too advanced, too efficient, too far ahead of the world that created it. In the final weeks before the program ended, Jack Northrop visited the airfield one last time. The remains of his aircraft lay scattered across the desert floor, torn wings, broken engines, shredded aluminum glinting in the sunlight. He picked up a small fragment of metal, turned it in his hand, and whispered to one of his engineers. They killed the wing because it had no tail, but someday they'll build it again. He was right. The idea he had pioneered that lift and stealth could live in the same design would sleep beneath classified files for nearly 40 years. But in the skies above California, the shape of the future had already flown. The world just wasn't ready to see it. When the bulldozers finished their work, the desert was silent again. The Flying Wing was gone. Its blueprints were sealed, its test data locked away, and its creator Jack Northrop had vanished from public life. To the outside world, it was just another cancelled project, another casualty of post-war politics. But to those who had worked on it, the loss felt like a death. The hangars at Hawthorne were empty, but the memory of the wing lingered, the shape, the silence, the way it had seemed to disappear against the sky. For most people, that was the end of the story. But history has a strange way of keeping secrets alive. Through the 1950s and 60s, aviation raced ahead. Jet engines grew stronger. Supersonic flight became possible. The Cold War divided the world, and new bombers, the B-47, the B-52, filled the skies. They were powerful machines, but crude in their own way, heavy, loud, and bright on radar. The B-52, designed to carry nuclear weapons, was massive and unmistakable, easily tracked from thousands of miles away. Jack Northrop's sleek, tailless design, the one that radar had once struggled to see, was forgotten. Or at least it seemed forgotten. Inside the US military's research labs, a handful of scientists still whispered about the wing that couldn't be found. They had seen the radar data, read the classified reports. They knew that the Flying Wing had produced the smallest radar echo ever recorded from a manned bomber. But no one dared bring it up. The age of stealth had not yet arrived. The world was still obsessed with power, not invisibility. In the early 1970s, something changed. Radar technology had become so advanced that no aircraft, no matter how fast or high, could hide. Surface-to-air missiles were devastating modern jets over Vietnam. The question became simple, but revolutionary. What if the answer wasn't speed, but invisibility? At Lockheed's Skunk Works, engineers began experimenting with radar deflecting geometry angular surfaces that could scatter radar waves away from the source. This led to the first true stealth aircraft, the F-117 Nighthawk. But as they worked on the Nighthawk's shape, some of the team started digging through old archives reports from the 1940s, forgotten files about low radar return flying wings. That's when they rediscovered Jack Northrop. Buried deep in Air Force storage, they found radar test data from 1943 and 1944 showing how the wooden N1M and XB-35 prototypes had almost vanished from early radar systems. The reports described anomalous radar returns and loss of signal coherence, a technical language for we couldn't see it. The engineers realized with a mix of awe and disbelief that the first stealth aircraft had already been built by a man who had no computer, no radar cross-section theory, and no funding beyond his belief that the perfect airplane was also the simplest one. Around the same time, historians and engineers at the Smithsonian were studying another relic, the captured remains of a German Horten Ho 229. Its designers, Riemar and Walter Horten, had also built their flying wing out of wood and charcoal composites, hoping it would evade Allied radar. When a scientist examined it decades later, they discovered the same phenomenon. Its smooth, organic curves absorbed radar energy far better than conventional aircraft. Two nations, two designs, two separate discoveries of stealth, both born in the chaos of World War II, both abandoned when peace returned. It was as if the future had appeared in 1944, only for the world to look away. By the late 1970s, Northrop's company, now called Northrop Corporation, had returned to prominence. The Cold War had reignited, and the Air Force was searching for a new long-range stealth bomber to replace its aging fleet. Inside Northrop's headquarters, a small team of engineers began studying every scrap of information about radar-absorbing shapes, and inevitably their research led back to one name: Jack Northrop. The engineers pored over the old flying wing designs, the N1M, the XB-35, the EB-49. They traced the curves, the sweep, the angles. The data matched almost perfectly with modern stealth equations. The revelation was stunning. Jack Northrop had, through intuition alone, built an aircraft whose radar signature was smaller than any modern bomber until the 1980s. His design, his geometry, was mathematically stealthy before anyone even knew what that meant. Meanwhile, the Air Force was working on its most secret program yet, Advanced Technology Bomber out of the future B-2. The competition came down to two companies, Lockheed and Northrop. Northrop's engineers knew this was their chance not just to win a contract, but to redeem a legacy. They revisited Jack's ideas, blending them with new materials and computing power. Their designs were strikingly familiar. A massive, all-wing aircraft with no tail, no fuselage, and smooth edges that curved like flowing water. It wasn't imitation. It was resurrection. The Flying Wing had returned this time, cloaked in radar-absorbing composites and powered by quiet jet engines buried deep inside. But still, in the company's private moments, the engineers admitted that the math alone didn't explain it. The intuition behind the shape, the understanding of airflow, stability, and reflection came from Northrop himself. His genius had been too far ahead of its time to be recognized, but not too far to be rediscovered. By 1979, Jack Northrop was 84 years old. He had suffered a stroke and was confined to a wheelchair, his speech limited, his hands trembling. He hadn't been to his company in decades. One afternoon, a group of engineers came to visit him. They brought with them a small model, sleek, black, and triangular, with a shape he would have recognized instantly. When they placed it in front of him, he ran his hand over its smooth surface. Tears welled in his eyes. He couldn't speak much anymore, but he whispered one sentence: "I know that shape." A few months later, Jack Northrop passed away. He never saw the final aircraft fly, but he didn't need to. He knew. For nearly 40 years, the Flying Wing had been forgotten, a ghost of engineering buried under politics and paperwork. But its shape never truly died. It waited in silence until technology caught up with vision. In 1981, when the Northrop team won the contract to build the new stealth bomber, they didn't start from scratch. They opened a file drawer, pulled out the old drawings, and began where Jack had left off. Every line, every curve of the B-2 Spirit was the rebirth of the wooden aircraft that radar could not see. In the spring of 1988, at a heavily guarded airbase in California, a shape rolled out of the shadows. It was black, silent, and eerily familiar. Its surface caught the desert light like water. To those who saw it, the aircraft looked alien. To a few old engineers standing in the crowd, it looked like a ghost. The B-2 Spirit stealth bomber had been unveiled to the world, and with it, the resurrection of Jack Northrop's dream. 40 years after his Flying Wing had been destroyed, its shape had returned smoother, faster, and now invisible not only to radar, but to the human eye at night. The B-2 Spirit was unlike anything ever built. It could fly 6,000 miles without refueling, carry both conventional and nuclear weapons, and remain virtually undetectable to radar. Its surface was coated in radar-absorbing materials. Its engines were buried within its wings to mask heat and noise. Its flight computer made constant, invisible corrections to keep it stable, because even in the 1980s, a true Flying Wing was too aerodynamically pure to fly itself unaided. But beneath the carbon fiber, titanium, and digital code lay a design older than the Cold War itself. The same curved geometry that Jack Northrop had drawn by hand in the 1930s. The same angles, the same sweep, the same dream. When journalists asked Northrop's company representatives where the shape had come from, they said, it came from the data. But the engineers who had studied his blueprints knew better. It came from Jack. In declassified Air Force reports, analysts later wrote that the Flying Wing's concept had been 30 years ahead of its time. What Northrop had achieved intuitively with wood and glue, modern computers had only just begun to understand. He had believed that the sky rewarded simplicity, that the fewer parts an airplane had, the less it fought the air. He was right. The B-2's perfect curves scattered radar like ripples on a lake. Its absence of tails and vertical surfaces erased any sharp reflections. It was the natural evolution of his work, the aircraft that proved his vision was not a fantasy, but prophecy. And though Jack Northrop was gone, the engineers felt his presence everywhere. In the smoothness of the wingtips, in the silent lift of takeoff, in the way the aircraft vanished from radar like a whisper swallowed by the wind. When the B-2 made its first public flight, many in the crowd applauded its technological achievement. But for those who knew the story, those who remembered the wooden wings torn apart by bulldozers, it was more than progress. It was justice. One of Northrop's surviving test engineers, now an old man, said quietly, "Jack was 40 years too early, but he was never wrong." In that moment, the lines between past and future blurred. The war-era wooden wing and the space-age stealth bomber became one story, two ends of the same vision separated by time. Jack Northrop had once said that the perfect aircraft would look as if it had been sculpted by the wind itself. Looking at the B-2, the world finally understood what he meant. The B-2 Spirit entered service in 1997, nearly half a century after the first Flying Wing had taken flight. Only 21 were ever built. Each cost over $2 billion, but price was never the point. They were symbols of dominance, of technological mastery, and of a simple truth. The world had finally caught up to an idea born in the 1930s. Every line of the B-2 traced back to Northrop's N1M, the wooden prototype that had barely cleared the desert floor in 1940. The stealth technology that defined modern warfare was not born in secret laboratories. It was born in the hands of a quiet engineer carving wood with a dream. The future had been hiding inside the past all along. Before his death, Jack Northrop told a friend, "I don't care who gets the credit. I just want to see it fly again." He never saw the B-2 in the air, but he lived long enough to see the model that carried its shape, and that was enough. He had endured defeat, humiliation, and silence. Yet history proved him right. His concept outlasted empires, wars, and generations. The Flying Wing had become the stealth bomber, the machine that changed warfare without firing a shot, not through destruction, but through invisibility. In the end, the story of Jack Northrop is more than the story of an airplane. It's the story of faith in an idea, faith strong enough to survive failure, politics, and time itself. Every innovation begins as a question. Jack's question was simple. What if we didn't fight the air? What if we let it carry us? That question led to a design that radar couldn't see, that engineers couldn't forget, and that history couldn't bury. The Flying Wing was never just about war. It was about perfection, about creating something so balanced, so pure, that it seemed alive. And when it returned as the B-2 Spirit, it carried not only technology, but the soul of the man who imagined it. Today, the last surviving fragments of Jack Northrop's original wings rest in museums and archives, faded blueprints, worn photographs, a few wooden ribs preserved behind glass. They look fragile, outdated. But every time a B-2 Spirit glides silently across the sky, those fragments live again. From wood and glue to carbon and code, from dream to shadow, the journey came full circle. The man who built a wooden aircraft invisible to radar had unknowingly drawn the outline of the 21st century. And though Jack Northrop's name is rarely spoken alongside the great inventors of the modern age, his work changed everything. Because every time the world looks up and sees nothing, it's his invisible hand still shaping the air.